Years ago, I was called to perform a unique memorial service. The woman died at the age of 91, a mother of 3 girls, grandmother of 6, great-grandmother of 3. She'd been a Unitarian Universalist her entire adult life, a Girl Scout leader, a devoted wife. I had never met the woman. She'd lived in a nearby retirement home, and long before I arrived, she'd been grappling with Alzheimer's. It all but erased her memory in the end. She didn't recognize her daughters, although, and this always amazes me, their mother's good manners and kindness stayed until the end, may it be for us all. So that each time they'd visit, she'd welcome her daughters into the room, ask them their names, and to tell her a little bit about themselves, thank them graciously for coming, not having the vaguest idea who they were. They were sad to lose their mother, but as is almost always the case in such instances, they had really lost her long ago. When it came time to plan her service, I began, as I always do, asking the daughters to tell me about their mother, about the things they remembered most about her, and they began saying the most wonderful things. They told me about a woman of infinite patience who was kind and fun and intelligent, who was devoted to them and their father, a woman who taught them to be generous with themselves, to spare the world and others hurt whenever they could, to do good and to speak good, and to be independent also. Listening to them, it was clear the proof was in the pudding, as they say. This woman had raised 3 warm, wonderfully good women. You loved them immediately. In telling me about their mother, they talked about how she was talented and never lost her temper. They told me how she would drive the whole neighborhood, I'm imagining in various caravans to get them all there, 5 miles to the best sledding hill in the county whenever it snowed. How she made sock monkeys by the hundreds for children at the local hospital. They told me, in other words, all the good stuff. However, as you may have experienced, in funerals, it's often just as important to recognize a person's flaws. After all, not only do you want to represent a person's full humanity, their strengths and their weaknesses, but you want the service to ring true. Obviously, if the person who has died is stubborn or prone to drink or to something else that was painful, well then everyone in the room is going to know it anyway, right? And if you don't mention it, it becomes the elephant in the room that kind of gets in the way. You'd be amazed how often when you speak aloud such a truth, graciously worded, when you say, for instance, well, but we all know also that Joe could be a stubborn pain in the neck. How much laughter there is in the room in that moment, and how much more real the service becomes in an instant. That one phrase, it's given everyone permission to tell the full story and to mourn the real person. So I explained all of this to these 3 women and their spouses who were gathered. and they agreed that it was a good and important thing to be honest. And then there was this silence as they sat for a minute and thought about what else might need to be said. They thought, and they thought, until finally one of their husbands chimed in. Carol was an inveterate saver, he said. I mean, she had drawers filled with those garbage twisty ties. And she had a closet filled with half-finished monkey sock dolls that she hadn't yet made up for the kids in the hospital. And they all nodded in agreement. So this woman who drove all the kids in the neighborhood 5 miles to the best sledding hill in the county whenever it snowed, who taught her daughters to love nature and preserve it, and cooked a fantastic blueberry cobbler, she had a dark side. Garbage twisty ties. So on a day when I am set to preach about the ideal of motherhood that we can, none of us, ever live up to, full disclosure requires that I did once in my life participate in a memorial service for just such a mother, maybe more than once. But perhaps what I want to say from the onset to all of us here today is that the ideal, even if it's possible for some, is still one we can let go of, and maybe even should. Let me say a little bit about why. First, the personal. My entire life, I knew I would never be the perfect mother. Patience, to begin with, is not my strong suit. And even though I delayed parenting until midway through my 30s, I could have waited until I was 75 if nature would have cooperated, and I wouldn't have developed the equanimity to be like the woman I just described to you. Still, with the help of a great team of doctors who helped to make it so, 15 years ago, tomorrow, actually, my daughter was born. And despite me, she's turning out to be pretty fabulous. But as a prerequisite to risking being her mom, I had to know I would never be perfect at it. Second, there is no doubt that being a great parent is more possible if we had great parenting. And I would bet that there are lots of us out here who did not get great parenting, great mothering. We might not talk about it, we may not share it with our colleagues at work, or maybe even with our friends, all of them. But it is, I know, the case that much pain is done in the name of love. Two of my closest friends, female friends, for example, had long bouts with bulimia. Both trace that struggle back to things their mothers said, ongoing messages of criticism that tied future happiness to body size and shape, messages they heard loud and clear at a time when they were young and adolescent and tender. I know their moms. I love their moms. I'm sure their moms did and said what they thought was something that would set their daughters on the best course in light of the lookist culture they knew they would face. And they made a bad call. Further, whether it's on this issue or 1,000 others we can think of, most of us are doomed to make 1 or 2 or 24 bad calls as parents. My husband calls them the down payments on therapy. We're bound to, right? I mean, we are human and flawed and trying to do our best, and sometimes our best just isn't perfection. So if we didn't grow up with perfection, and we're bound not to be perfect, you and I, why set ourselves up for an ideal of perfection? Why draw a portrait, for instance, of motherhood that only makes it look so darn scary? Why not set goals not based on the perfect mother, maybe not even based on the good mother, but the good enough mother, and save ourselves the angst? Well, what would this woman, this person look like? What might they look like? Before I begin, I'm going to give credit where credit is due. The phrase good enough mother comes from D.W. Winnicott, a pediatrician come psychoanalytic theorist who pioneered the idea of the good enough mother up against the idea of the perfect mom. His notion is a bit of a setup, I'm just going to say, because for Winnicott, the perfect mother, as he describes her, is perfect from the infant's perspective. The perfect mother satisfies all of the infant's needs and quickly, while the good enough mother lets there be a lag. So the child learns to experience want and frustration and is gradually motivated to do and find and achieve for themselves. The good enough mother for Winnicott is always loving and patient, by the way. She never retaliates against her infant or shows anger or frustration. Through love and increasingly leaving the child to struggle, she teaches it independence. In that sense, actually, slightly annoyingly, Winnicott's mother is the perfect mother, right? She perfectly prepares her child for adult life. What is most striking to me about Winnicott's mother is that what she has mastered is not seeing her child's suffering or struggles or pain as indictments of her parenting. Part of this pain is life, she realizes, and she lets her children learn to face it while there's still someone there to back them up. Bruno Bettelheim wrote a book called The Good Enough Parent. And he takes Winnicott's theory one step further. Bettelheim suggests that one ought not to try to be a perfect parent, but for other reasons. In part because of what it says to a child about expectations you have for them. Perfection, in other words, is this dangerous and destructive ideal, and one which is particularly corrosive as a centerpiece around which to build family life, to foster impatience with human frailty and flaws. By modeling an impatience with your own, well, it breeds contempt for self and others, he argues. And this, in turn, can get in the way, actually, of what is perhaps the most important gift that parents, mothers, fathers can give a child, and that is the gift of modeling how to love and stay connected to other people. Perfection is a hard burden to bear for our kids. Maybe some of us felt it ourselves growing up. Florida Scott Maxwell wrote in her The Measure of My Days, "A mother never outgrows the burden of love, and to the end she carries the weight of hope for those she bore." Oddly, very oddly, she is forever surprised and even faintly wronged that her sons and daughters are just people. The parent who cannot make room for their own humanity maybe has a hard time granting their children their own, and all suffer as a result. Because kids will be kids, and mothers will be late, and sometimes grumpy, and sometimes forget, and even be mean. And if we forgive ourselves for not being the ideal parent, we will do far more for our children. What more powerful way is there, after all, to communicate to our children that no matter what life brings them, where they stumble and where they soar, they'll be acceptable, not just to us, but to themselves also. That no one is asking for perfection, no perfect children, no perfect mothers in our world, just the old college try, the gentleman's C, the good enough striving. For life is in the journey, and perfection often actually gets in the way. I cannot forget my mother, theologian Renita Weems writes. Though not as sturdy as others, she is my bridge. When I needed to get across, she steadied herself long enough for me to run across safely. May we do that for our kids. All of them, in all the ways we own children in this world. Ourselves, sometimes weak and sometimes unstable, maybe faltering, but determined. May we pick the times to be steady and strong, and the presence that makes their journey from childhood to adulthood possible. Because as the children's book this morning rightly points out, there are lots of things moms can't do, more than you can count. And that's okay, because there is one thing they do better than almost anyone else, and that's love their children. As flawed as we are, we can love the children and teach them to love themselves, and that is good enough and more than enough. So happy Mother's Day, everyone. To the good and good enough mothers and the good and good enough others, and everyone who loves with their whole selves wherever mothering is needed in this gorgeous, growing world. I wish lanyards to you all.